I moved into what I thought was a peaceful neighborhood. The kind of place you see in magazines, manicured lawns, white picket fences, and neighbors who wave politely as you walk by. I even imagined myself sitting on the porch sipping coffee, enjoying quiet mornings. That's exactly how it should have been. But reality, as I soon discovered, had a very different sense of humor. It started with an email, one of those friendly reminders from the HOA, but the words had a sharp edge. Your mailbox does not meet community standards, it said. I blinked. My mailbox, I had bought it from a reputable store, painted it navy blue, the exact shade they recommend in the HOA guide. I ignored it, thinking it was just a small mistake, a bureaucratic hiccup. But ignoring an HOA is like ignoring a ticking time bomb. You think you're safe until it explodes. A few days later, there was a knock at my door. 2 police officers stood on my porch looking as confused as I felt. We received complaints regarding your mailbox, one said. I forced a laugh. My mailbox, officers, I assure you it's perfectly functional and perfectly painted. They didn't laugh, they didn't even look convinced. That was my first taste of what life under HOA scrutiny would feel like. Then came Karen, the HOA president. I don't know how to describe her without sounding dramatic, but she had the presence of someone who truly believed she was on a sacred mission. She wore perfectly pressed suits even in 90-degree weather, her heels clicking like warning bells whenever she approached. And her eyes, let's just say they could bore through steel. The first time she showed up at my door, clipboard in hand, I was convinced I had done something catastrophic, though I had no idea what. Your lawn, she said, frowning, is too green. I stared. Too green? I had watered it exactly according to the HOA guidelines. I'm sorry, I asked. It's vibrant, she clarified. Too vibrant, the neighbors have noticed. I almost laughed out loud, but I caught myself. You don't laugh at Karen, that's rule number 1. Within a week, the fines started piling up. First for my mailbox, then my lawn, then my welcome mat. I got a notice that my garden gnome was in violation because it was not in harmony with community aesthetics. A gnome. I stared at it, a tiny ceramic figure with a fishing pole, and wondered how this had turned into a federal crime in the world of HOA regulations. Then came the police visits again. Each knock at my door was accompanied by a polite officer trying to explain a complaint I didn't make. We received a report about excessive noise, one said. From what? I asked. From your lawnmower, he replied. I hadn't touched my lawnmower in days. It's quiet, I said, hopping for reason. Karen had already made her call. I realized very quickly that ignoring her wasn't going to work. I began documenting everything. Dates, times, what was said, every knock, every email, every threat. I even started taking discreet videos and notes in a small notebook. At the time, it felt like paranoia, but it was actually survival. I didn't know it yet, but these small actions would later become my lifeline. Still, I tried to keep some humor in it. I would tell my friends, I live in a place where my mailbox can get me arrested and my lawn can summon the police. They laughed, but I could see the flicker of concern in their eyes. I was starting to feel trapped, like a character in some absurd comedy drama where the rules didn't make sense, but the consequences were terrifyingly real. The suspense was constant. Every time I heard a car pull into the driveway, my heart would race. Every email from the HOA made me tense, and every knock at the door was a reminder that life under Karen's rule wasn't just inconvenient, it was downright hostile. Little did I know this was only the beginning. The recording device tucked into my pocket, the notebook filled with dates and notes, and my patience were about to become my most valuable weapons. Because Karen wasn't just an HOA president, she was a force of nature, and her storm was only starting to hit. The knock at my door became part of my daily routine, almost like a grim alarm clock. Some mornings I'd wake up and wonder, will it be the mailman or will it be Karen's latest complaint? And most days it was the latter or the police acting on her complaints. I quickly realized that living in this neighborhood wasn't about peaceful mornings or sipping coffee on the porch. It was about surviving one petty attack after another. One day I opened the door to find 2 officers staring at me, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and awkward pity. We've had complaints about your recycling bins, one said. My recycling bins, I had faithfully separated plastics, paper, and glass. I had followed the rules perfectly. Are they overflowing? I asked, trying to make sense of it. No, they're not overflowing, he replied. I blinked. Then what's the problem? He shrugged. The complaint didn't specify. Karen had called again. That's when I realized that the HOA wasn't just about enforcing rules, they were about control. Every minor detail of life in my yard, on my porch, or even in my mailbox could be turned into a weapon against me. A crooked fence post, that's a violation. Flowers planted 1 inch too close, another violation. One neighbor complained about my dog barking once. Suddenly, I was under investigation. I started planning my day around avoiding unnecessary attention. I watered my lawn only in the early morning, I avoided chatting with neighbors too much, and I triple-checked every email I sent. It felt ridiculous. And yet, each visit from the police reminded me that it wasn't just paranoia, it was survival. Still, I tried to find humor in the absurdity. One afternoon, Karen appeared on my lawn, clipboard in hand, inspecting the grass. She tilted her head, squinting at a dandelion. "This dandelion," she announced, pointing dramatically, "violates our community aesthetics. You must remove it immediately." I laughed nervously, pointing at her with the hose. "Do I water the grass too much or too little if I comply?" I asked. She didn't even flinch. Every word she spoke felt like a courtroom cross-examination, and every glance she gave made me feel guilty for existing. The stress started to get under my skin. I would lie in bed at night, replaying each encounter, thinking of ways to prove my innocence before the next police visit. I realized I couldn't just wait for things to get better. Karen wasn't going to stop. If anything, the more I tried to stay calm, the more she seemed to escalate. It was during one of these tense mornings that I had an idea. If I could document her harassment, if I could record her every absurd accusation and threat, I might finally have a way to protect myself. I bought a small voice recorder and began carrying it everywhere. At first, it felt awkward, like spying, but then I realized I wasn't doing anything wrong. She was the one breaking boundaries, not me. That same day, another officer appeared at my door. This time, it was over my mailbox again, and the tension was almost comical. "It's still navy blue," I said, "and perfectly aligned with the sidewalk." The officer nodded, caught in the middle of a bizarre feud he didn't understand. Karen had called while I was speaking to him, her voice rising in the background. I could hear her through the line, lecturing the officer about my crimes against the neighborhood. It was absurd, stressful, and darkly funny all at once. I began to notice something. Every complaint she made, every officer she involved, only strengthened my resolve. I was no longer just trying to survive. I was gathering evidence, collecting the ridiculous proof that would eventually turn the tables. The recording device in my pocket suddenly felt like a shield, a tiny weapon against the constant onslaught. By the end of the week, I felt a strange mixture of fear, exhaustion, and determination. Karen didn't know it yet, but every time she called the police or issued a fine, she was writing her own downfall into history. And I was ready to turn her words into my secret armor and eventually my revenge. Little did I know, the storm wasn't slowing down, it was building. And the next time Karen showed up, things would escalate in ways I couldn't yet imagine. By the time the third week rolled around, I had started to feel like a permanent resident of a police station disguised as a suburban home. Every morning, I checked my mailbox with a nervous glance, half expecting a fine taped to the top, half expecting a police officer hiding behind the hedge. Living here felt like navigating a minefield where the mines were invisible, and stepping on one could ruin your week or your life. Karen had upped her game. She no longer just inspected the lawn or the mailbox, she inspected me. She would stand at the edge of my property, clipboard clutched like a weapon, scanning every inch of my house, my yard, my car, even the angle of my blinds. One morning she appeared while I was carrying a trash bag to the curb. She squinted at me. "Is that bag placed at the exact angle specified in the HOA guidelines?" she demanded. I froze. "It's upright," I ventured. She shook her head slowly, as if disappointed in the very concept of uprightness. I tried to keep my humor alive, if only to avoid losing my mind completely. I would whisper to myself things like, "Congratulations, you live in a place where the wind can get you fined," or "If my dog barks twice, I might go to jail." It was ridiculous, yes, but sometimes the absurdity was the only thing keeping me sane. Neighbors were watching, some from their windows, some from behind fences. I wasn't sure if they were rooting for me or hoping I'd lose. Some offered quiet sympathy. "You just ignore her and she'll tire herself out," one neighbor whispered. Ignore her? I had tried. I had ignored emails, ignored knock-knocks, ignored the police visits. It didn't work. Karen thrived on attention. Her power came from escalation, and every small act of resistance made her escalate further. One afternoon, she confronted me in front of my garage. "Your garden gnome is still out of place," she declared, pointing at the tiny ceramic fisherman that had lived on my porch for years. I looked at it, then at her, and laughed nervously. "He's been fishing there for 5 years, I said. "Does he need a relocation permit?" She didn't laugh, she didn't even blink. Instead, she took out her phone and called the HOA board right there in front of me, explaining in dramatic detail how I was endangering community aesthetics. It was at that moment I realized something crucial. Karen's obsession wasn't just with rules, it was with control. Everything I did, every inch of my property, every action I took was under scrutiny, and every time she escalated, I felt my anxiety rise, but I also noticed something else. Her overconfidence, her constant threats, her insistence on dragging the police into every petty disagreement, it was a weakness, a flaw, and that flaw was about to become my greatest weapon. I decided to step up my game. I carried my small voice recorder everywhere, every conversation, every inspection, every confrontation, I captured it. I didn't know exactly how it would help yet, but instinct told me it would, and the more I recorded, the more I started seeing patterns. Karen repeated the same threats, the same accusations, the same dramatic gestures over and over. It was almost like she was giving me a script for my eventual defense. Evenings were the worst. I'd lie awake, replaying her latest antics in my head. The officers who showed up bewildered sometimes had no idea what to do with her. And while I felt trapped, I also felt a small spark of hope. Every call she made, every officer visit, every ridiculous fine only added to the growing mountain of evidence I was building quietly, meticulously. By the end of that week, I realized something important. Fear could paralyze me, yes, but it could also sharpen me. And while Karen thought she had me cornered, I was learning her habits, her patterns, her weaknesses. The game wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And somewhere deep inside, a tiny, cautious voice whispered, "Wait until she realizes you're not just surviving, you're preparing." Little did I know the next step, the recording that would change everything, was closer than I thought, waiting for the perfect moment to be captured. I had started carrying the small voice recorder in my pocket everywhere, mostly out of paranoia, but also because I knew I needed proof. At first, it felt strange, like I was a spy in my own life, but Karen left me no choice. She wasn't just a strict HOA president anymore. She was a full-blown antagonist in a suburban drama that I hadn't auditioned for. That fateful afternoon, Karen decided to pay me a routine inspection visit. I could tell she was in peak form. Her heels clicked like gunshots against the sidewalk, and her clipboard was raised as if it were a sword. The moment she stepped onto my property, I hit the record button, slipping the device into my pocket. She wasted no time. "Your lawn is too green, it's practically blinding the neighbors," she said, squinting at the grass like she had a microscope instead of her eyes. I blinked. "It's green?" I asked, trying not to laugh. She tilted her head, her expression fierce. "Yes, green, but not in a subtle, acceptable way. This is a violation of the community's visual harmony." I held my ground, taking notes silently in my head while recording every absurd word. "And that gnome," she continued, pointing at my ceramic fisherman who looked more confused than ever. "He is still not in alignment with the HOA aesthetics. Move him or face further penalties." By now, the recording was capturing her every syllable, her dramatic pauses, even the huff of frustration when I dared to answer her back. I realized this was golden. Every threat, every exaggerated complaint, every call she made to involve the police, it was all being documented without her knowing. "Your mailbox, it's crooked again," she said next. I tried to respond, but she waved me off like a child speaking out of turn. "I've measured it 3 times this week. It tilts slightly to the left, which is unacceptable. That left tilt could destabilize community values." I choked back a laugh. The left tilt of a mailbox? I didn't even know that was a crime. As she ranted, I started noticing a pattern. Every single complaint she made was rooted not in logic but in control. She wanted to assert power, to make me feel small, to prove that she could dictate every detail of my life. And the more she ranted, the more I realized she was practically writing her own downfall. I had never felt this kind of tension before. My heart raced, but I also felt an odd thrill. I was gathering evidence against the most unreasonable person I had ever met. This wasn't just self-defense, it was strategy. I pictured the day I could finally play back this recording, the look on people's faces when they heard her over-the-top demands in her own words. By the end of the visit, Karen stomped off, muttering threats about fines, calls to the police, and even legal action. I smiled quietly to myself as I checked the recorder. Every second had been captured perfectly. I didn't just have proof of harassment, I had a weapon, a shield, and a future opportunity to turn the tables. That night, I listened to the recording again. Hearing her voice, the absurdity of her accusations, the sheer intensity with which she policed my life, it was almost comical. But beneath the humor was a powerful truth. I finally had control. For months, Karen had tried to dominate, intimidate, and harass me. Now the power was shifting. I spent the next few days carefully planning my next steps. I knew I couldn't just run to the HOA board or the police yet. Karen thrived on theatrics. She would twist any complaint into a story where she was the victim. I needed to strategize to make sure my recording had maximum impact. Every detail mattered, every word mattered. For the first time since moving in, I felt a spark of hope. The endless harassment, the late-night anxiety, the constant fear of police knocks, it all had a purpose now. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was preparing for the moment when Karen would face the consequences of her own words. And somewhere deep inside, a part of me couldn't help but smile. The storm had arrived, but I was ready. I had a weapon Karen couldn't see, and soon she would learn that the person she tried to crush was quietly becoming unstoppable. I knew it was only a matter of time before I had to face the HOA board. The recording in my pocket had become my secret weapon, but I also knew that presenting it would require nerves of steel. Karen, as always, was unpredictable, dramatic, and frankly terrifying when she wanted to be. She thrived on confrontation, and I had no intention of giving her an easy win. The day of the board meeting arrived, and I felt like a soldier preparing for battle. The room was small, the fluorescent lights too bright, the air thick with tension. Board members sat on one side, Karen standing tall and smug, clipboard in hand. I walked in, recorder discreetly in my pocket, and took a seat across from her. She gave me a look that could freeze fire. I smiled politely, pretending to be calm, while inside my mind raced. Karen started the meeting with a dramatic flourish. "This gathering is to address ongoing violations by one particular homeowner," she announced, pointing a rigid finger at me. I could feel the eyes of the board members shift between us, some sympathetic, some wary. She began reading her list of grievances: crooked mailbox, too vibrant lawn, gnome placement, and more. By now, the list was absurdly long, and each complaint sounded more ridiculous than the last. I waited until she paused for breath. Then, very calmly, I reached into my pocket and pressed play on the recorder. Her voice filled the room, each word dripping with anger, each threat as exaggerated as the last. I watched as her eyes widened in disbelief as she heard herself accuse me of crimes that sounded almost surreal when played back aloud. The room went silent. Board members looked at each other, trying not to laugh or grimace at the theatrical performance they were now hearing. Karen sputtered, attempting to regain control, but it was too late. Every word she had spoken in private, every call she had made to involve the police, every over-the-top accusation, it was all captured and undeniable. That's taken out of context," she stammered, waving her hands wildly. The irony was almost too much. Karen had spent months creating a narrative where she was the hero, the enforcer of justice, the protector of community values. And now her own words had painted a completely different picture, one of obsession, harassment, and petty tyranny. The board members were no longer on her side. One of them, a quiet woman who had been watching from the back, leaned forward. "I think we need to consider the evidence before making further judgments," she said, her tone firm but calm. I felt a rush of relief. Finally, the absurdity of Karen's actions was being recognized by those who had previously let her antics slide. Karen, desperate, tried a new tactic. She turned to the board, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "You can't believe them, they're lying. This recording, it's edited, it's manipulated." The room erupted in murmurs. I stayed calm, letting the recorder continue its relentless truth. The recording needed no edits, it needed no manipulation. It was a perfect reflection of her own obsession, captured word for word. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear who held the upper hand. Karen was flustered, fumbling for explanations, her theatrics no longer working. I could see the realization dawn on her face. Her power was slipping, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The board had seen the evidence, and for the first time in months, I felt hope, a genuine, undeniable hope that the nightmare was finally turning. As I left the meeting, I felt a mix of relief and lingering tension. Karen's war wasn't over yet, but I had delivered the first major blow. The recording had spoken louder than her threats ever could, and somewhere deep inside, I knew that the coming days would be critical. Every step I took now, every interaction, could push her further toward the consequences she had tried so hard to avoid. I walked home that evening, the weight of months of harassment lifting slightly off my shoulders. For the first time, I believed that justice wasn't just a word, it was possible, and it could be delivered with patience, persistence, and of course, a little strategic recording. The storm was far from over, but for the first time, I was standing in the eye of it, ready for whatever came next. After the board meeting, I knew I couldn't rely on them to completely stop Karen. The recording had shaken her credibility, yes, but she was still dangerous. She was the kind of person who could manipulate anyone, twist any situation, and turn a minor complaint into a major disaster. I realized I needed real protection, legal protection. I called a lawyer I'd been considering for months. Explaining the situation felt both ridiculous and oddly satisfying. "I have a full record of harassment," I said, "including voice recordings, emails, police visits, and absurd fines for things like the color of my lawn." He listened carefully, didn't laugh, well, not too much, and agreed to take the case seriously. For the first time, I felt like I had an ally in the real world, someone who understood that this wasn't just petty HOA drama, it was harassment. Meanwhile, Karen didn't slow down. If anything, she accelerated. Police officers kept knocking at my door, each time delivering complaints that grew more absurd. One morning, an officer appeared, trying not to laugh as he handed me a citation for illegal lawn ornament placement. Apparently, the HOA had rewritten rules overnight, adding new restrictions about gnome alignment. I thanked him politely and watched as he walked away, clearly questioning his life choices. The recording in my pocket became my constant companion. I would play snippets for my lawyer, who nodded approvingly at the detailed evidence. Karen's words, so over the top, so dramatic, were perfect. Threats, exaggerated accusations, and her insistence on involving police for trivial matters, it was all there. I realized that every complaint she made, every visit, every call to the authorities was strengthening my case. She was unwittingly building the evidence I would need to finally hold her accountable. As the legal process started, Karen's behavior became even more erratic. She called me repeatedly, leaving messages full of rage and warnings about community justice. She even tried to corner me during casual walks in the neighborhood, approaching with a clipboard and a glare that could melt steel. But now, instead of fear, I felt a mix of amusement and determination. Every time she tried to intimidate me, I quietly recorded it, knowing that each interaction was another brick in the foundation of her eventual downfall. Neighbors began noticing the change, too. Some gave me knowing smiles, as if silently cheering me on. Others whispered about her increasingly dramatic antics, wondering how far she would go before someone finally stood up to her. I realized that while Karen had terrorized me, she had also alienated herself from the community. That isolation would eventually work in my favor. The tension was relentless. Every day brought a new ridiculous complaint, a new confrontation, a new police visit, and every day I kept my recorder on, capturing it all. By this point, I had become almost surgical in my approach. I documented, I strategized, and I waited. Patience was key. Karen was powerful, yes, but predictable. Her obsession with control made her reckless, and reckless people make mistakes, big ones. One afternoon, my lawyer called with good news. The authorities had reviewed the evidence and were beginning to take Karen seriously. My recordings, emails, and detailed logs painted a clear picture of harassment, and finally someone with authority was paying attention. It was a relief, but also a tense moment. I knew that once the investigation started, Karen's reactions would be explosive. Every interaction would matter. Every word she spoke could be used against her. I spent the next few days preparing, reviewing my evidence, and mentally bracing myself for the next wave. Karen didn't know that the very things she had done to terrorize me were now the tools of her undoing. The irony wasn't lost on me. The storm was building, but this time I wasn't afraid. I was ready. I had the proof, I had the law on my side, and I had the patience to see it through. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. Karen had been relentless, but now the tide was turning. The harassment that had consumed my life was about to become her undoing. And when the day finally came, I knew that justice wouldn't just be a word, it would be a performance delivered perfectly in her own voice with the law as my witness. The storm was no longer just looming, it was about to hit. The day the authorities finally started paying attention to Karen, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and disbelief. After months of harassment, police visits, and absurd fines, it was finally happening. Karen, who had once walked into my yard like she owned the place, was now under scrutiny, and the irony was delicious. I received a call from my lawyer early that morning. "They've reviewed the recordings," he said, "and they're taking this seriously." I could hardly believe it. Every ridiculous accusation, every over-the-top threat, every minor complaint that had seemed like a personal attack, it was all going to be used against her. She had spent months building her empire of fear, and now that empire was crumbling from within. Karen, of course, had no idea what was coming. That morning, she appeared at my door, clipboard raised high like a shield. Her heels clicked angrily against the sidewalk. "We need to discuss your ongoing violations immediately," she barked. I smiled politely, trying not to betray the giddy satisfaction I felt inside. "I think we've already discussed everything," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She didn't like that. Her eyes narrowed and she leaned closer, pointing a finger as if to assert dominance. But this time I had patience, strategy, and evidence on my side. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply continued my day, confident that the storm was about to turn in my favor. The investigation moved quickly. Authorities reviewed my recordings, emails, and logs, and every officer who had been called by Karen corroborated my story. The absurdity of her complaints, once terrifying, now worked against her. Each time she had called the police over lawn colors or mailbox angles, she had created a paper trail so detailed and over the top that even seasoned investigators couldn't ignore it. Neighbors began noticing the change. Karen, once the feared ruler of the street, now walked cautiously, avoiding eye contact. The board members who had previously nodded along with her theatrics were now watching silently, no longer willing to support her absurd claims. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and it was only a matter of time before the law would step in. One afternoon, I received the call I had been waiting for. Karen was officially under investigation for harassment. I could hardly sit still. After months of stress, fear, and absurd confrontations, the person who had made my life miserable was finally facing consequences. I allowed myself a small, private victory smile. Of course, she didn't take it quietly. Karen tried to rally her supporters, sending frantic emails to the board, calling neighbors, and even attempting to intimidate me in person. Every threat she made, however, was documented, recorded, and logged. The very behavior she had used to terrorize me was now her undoing. I watched it all unfold with a mix of amazement and dark humor. The tension reached a peak one afternoon when the authorities came to speak with her directly. I wasn't present, but I heard from neighbors that Karen was flustered, defensive, and increasingly desperate. The meticulous recordings I had made, capturing every outrageous claim and every demand for police involvement, were laid out as undeniable proof. It was as if the universe had handed me a front row seat to karma in action. By now, I felt a sense of relief, but also lingering suspense. Karen's fall was in motion, but I knew the final blow was yet to come. Every call, every interaction, every attempt at intimidation was being carefully catalogued by the authorities. Her empire of fear was unraveling thread by thread, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I walked through my neighborhood that evening, finally able to breathe a little easier. Neighbors nodded at me with quiet smiles, some whispering congratulations. The tension that had been a constant presence in my life for months was finally starting to lift, but I remained vigilant. Karen was still dangerous, still unpredictable, and still capable of drama that could shake the neighborhood. And yet, deep down, I knew this was the turning point. The storm that had once felt unending was finally breaking. Karen's reign of terror was collapsing under the weight of her own words, her own actions, and the evidence I had so carefully gathered. I had survived, yes, but more importantly, I had prepared for the day justice would finally arrive. The end of her control was near, and I was ready to witness it unfold. One final, satisfying chapter in a story that had started with a simple email and escalated into a months-long battle of wills, absurdity, and ultimately truth. The day finally came when Karen faced the consequences of her own actions. After months of harassment, absurd fines, police visits, and sleepless nights, justice had arrived in a way I had only dreamed of. I still remember waking up that morning with a strange mix of excitement and disbelief, wondering if this was really happening or if I had imagined it all in my long months of stress. Authorities had reviewed every recording, every email, and every log I had kept. Karen's over-the-top complaints and constant attempts to manipulate the police had become her undoing. Each ridiculous accusation, from my two-green lawn to the crooked mailbox, to the gnome that had become a symbol of absurdity, was now evidence of harassment. The very things that had terrorized me were now proof against her. I remember seeing her for the last time in person. She was no longer the self-righteous queen of the neighborhood. Her heels were less commanding, her clipboard hung limply at her side, and her gaze, once sharp and piercing, flitted nervously between neighbors who whispered behind their curtains. The power she had wielded for months had evaporated. The authorities moved quickly. Karen was officially cited and eventually taken into custody. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. I received messages from neighbors congratulating me, some apologetic for not believing me sooner, others relieved that the nightmare was finally over. I smiled quietly at each message, but I kept a calm exterior. Inside, I felt a combination of relief, triumph, and a lingering disbelief that this absurd saga had truly reached its conclusion. Walking through my yard that afternoon, I noticed the small details I had feared for months. The mailbox standing proudly, the lawn perfectly green, and the gnome fishing as if nothing had ever happened. For the first time in months, I could enjoy my home without the constant weight of anxiety pressing on me. I could finally relax. Reflecting on everything, I realized just how much I had endured. Karen's harassment had tested my patience, my sanity, and my sense of humor. Every absurd complaint, every late-night police visit, every threatening email had been a challenge, a test of how far I could go before breaking. And yet, through it all, I had survived, and I had found a way to fight back effectively. I thought back to the recording that had started it all. That tiny device, tucked into my pocket, had become more than just evidence. It had been a symbol of resilience. Every word Karen had spoken, every over-the-top threat, every ridiculous demand had been captured and preserved. It had allowed me to turn the tables in a way I never imagined possible. Neighbors started talking openly about the situation. Some laughed at the absurdity of it all, some expressed relief, and a few even confessed that they had lived in fear of Karen's whims themselves. I realized that while the story had been personal, it was also universal. A reminder that even the most petty, controlling people can be held accountable if you're patient, careful, and strategic. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, finally feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, and for the first time in months, I could truly enjoy the quiet. No knocks on the door, no frantic emails, no threats, just peace. And in that moment, I laughed quietly to myself, remembering every ridiculous encounter, every over-the-top inspection, every absurd accusation. Karen's reign had ended not with yelling or chaos, but with proof, patience, and persistence. Sometimes I realized the best revenge isn't dramatic, it's simply letting the law speak for you while you stay calm and collected. I looked at my lawn, my mailbox, my little gnome fisherman, and felt a surge of satisfaction. The neighborhood felt lighter, calmer, more alive. Life had returned to normal, or as normal as life can be when you've survived an HOA president determined to control every aspect of it. And somewhere deep down, I knew the lesson I had learned would stick with me forever. Patience, preparation, and a little strategy can turn even the most absurd nightmare into a story of triumph. Karen was gone, her power extinguished, and I had survived, not just intact but victorious. The storm had passed, the sun was shining, and finally I could enjoy my home, my peace, and my sanity, knowing that sometimes the smallest tools, the quiet recordings, the careful notes, the calm persistence, can topple the mightiest of petty tyrants. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.